Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and patch 11.05, WoW's 20th anniversary update, is bringing with it a ton of various new features, from brand new holiday celebrations outside of the cavern at the time, new world bosses, a brand new raid, but also a brand new leveling buff for you to get some ults up and running. And with it, they're also introducing a ton of new different class changes, from hero spec adjustments that finally alter and change some of the fantasy behind things like Dark Ranger and Totemic Shaman, but also various class and spec improvements that are more likely to get some of these playstyles back into the spotlight. And for what I spent over on the PTR realms, I picked out 5 specs that I think are probably seeing some of the biggest quality of life changes going forward, primarily focusing on specs that haven't seen wide popularity, so no Aug Evokers or Red Pallies or Arcane Mages or Frost Death Knights, anything that's kind of fallen off to the side that may have been seeing some play, but anything that isn't part of the current meta. But I did want to really highlight the 5 specs that I think are looking to flourish once 11.05 comes around, and I think that you should definitely give these playstyles a second chance during the 20th anniversary. As always, if you want to see more War Within updates like this regarding class changes, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe, but otherwise, let's dive right in. The first of these specs, in my opinion, is the Survival Hunter, which is going through a number of changes. Death Blow for all hunters becomes a common talent that you'll pick up pretty early on into the talent tree, and it becomes a core component, which means the ability of Kill Shot can now be used a lot more regularly outside of just executing your targets, which I think is going to spice up the rotation for all 3 specs, with Survival included. Survival in particular does also see some rotational changes to help reduce some of the bloat that it receives with an AoE in particular. Normally, the spec plays around spending and building focus. You spend focus through a variety of abilities. One of the easiest one is Raptor Strike. It's a pretty hard spender that just allows you to shave off a good portion of your focus. You can regen focus easily with a couple of kill commands, which also buff up your damage thanks to Tip of the Spear. Your next hard-hitting abilities now hit harder, and you can actually have those abilities scale a little bit more flanker's advantage. But the most important thing is you kill command a couple of times, and now you build up the damage buff of Tip of the Spear, so your next non-kill command abilities like your big grenades, or explosive shots, or even things like Fury of the Eagle, or your kill shot that we just talked about, all of those abilities is usually what you'll be buffing with the kill command ability. And that's a fine and good rotation for single target that actually has some of its own AoE components like grenades, as explosive shots, and even kill shots that can sometimes cleave multiple targets. It already creates a fairly single target cleavy rotation, but over in the live realms it becomes a lot more complicated when you start adding abilities like Butchery and managing stacks of Butchery, and how Butchery can now empower your Raptor Strikes to now start cleaving targets, and that puts a bleed that it just bogs down the entirety and the smoothness of Survival Hunter gameplay and gives you one too many things to manage, and they're trying to soften that up by quite a bit by reducing the AoE complexity and turning the ability of Butchery into simply one of those empowerment abilities, like your Wildfire Bomb, your Explosive Shot, your Kill Shot. Basically, Butchery becomes another one of those abilities with a set cooldown, but it hits much harder. Butchery now is an ability that hits incredibly hard, and also has an AoE component that is uncapped with Butchery, now able to bleed all targets it strikes with a bleed over 8 seconds. And that bleed damage actually now has a lot more scaling components that interact with the ability of Butchery in more interesting ways, but it also makes Survival Hunter one of the few classes that actually has some uncapped AoE potential in Mythic Plus content. And it actually is so strong that Butchery becomes an ability you'll probably end up utilizing even in single target. So it becomes exactly like your Wildfire Bombs, exactly like your kill shots that you'll want to empower whenever they're available. So it's just another one of those abilities, another one of those cooldowns that you'll want to manage and empower when possible. But then the ability of Butchery actually gains even more playability with the rest of your kit. Like, it's actually buffed up by things like Bloodseeker. Bloodseeker allows you and your pet to gain 10% attack speed for every bleeding enemy within 12 yards. And when you can bleed a bunch of enemies all at once, this actually offers quite a lot of additional passive damage for your Survival Hunter as well as your pet. And this playstyle actually now creates even a lot more synergy with Pack Leader, which is not as flashy as Sentinel when it comes to its hero specs, but now gains far more playability and a lot more interactions with the Survival Hunter talent tree. Like, for example, Pack Leader actually saw a few buffs with things like Wild Attacks, where Raptor Strike damage also got a 20% damage buff just for picking up this talent, kind of a significant buff there. but also Howl of the Pack. Wildfire Bomb also increases by 20% when you just pick up this talent on top of its original basic pet attack, synergy, combo, wombo, and crit damage components, which also play into the Survival Hunter gameplay. But you could actually take things a little bit further, because now this new talent interactions also play with pack leader like buffs to butchery. Either have Wildfire Bombs reduce the cooldown of butchery so you can use them more regularly as part of AoE, or have butchery buff the damage of your next butchery by 40%, so you can set up a massive butchery hit for single target or AoE. And because of those new bleed interactions, there's now Call the Herd, where kill shot deals additional damage over 6 seconds and also increases bleed damage that you and your pets deal by 25%. So if you can set up that big butchery damage with a big butchery bleed, Call the Herd on top of it, that could be a hard hitting ability that could just wreck enemies in AoE. And all of those new interactions are a welcome addition for survival that also don't necessarily complicate the playstyle of survival, but give it so much more depth, which is really exciting. Survival as a spec was a very popular pick back during the early days of the alpha and the beta of the War Within expansion, and it's sad to see that survival didn't quite make a transition into that popularity over until live realms, but hopefully all of these talent changes and revamps will give survival a little bit more breathing room going forward. Then we have the Spec of Mystery, which has got to be one of my favorite healing playstyles of all time, that is getting a bunch of new talents. Now, the talents themselves are pretty interesting all on their own, but where the possibilities really start to expand for Mistweaver is how you can synergize your already existing talents with the newer additions, which open up new avenues to create a bit more build variety. We see a lot of interesting option changes, such as buffs to Life Cocoon, primarily with 2 talents of Refreshment or Calming Coalescence, which could either increase the effectiveness of that shield of Cocoon, or to give it a bigger healing component, which actually makes this external ability a lot more powerful when it comes to group gameplay. Anti-Teachings on its own has become a passive that all monks get to utilize, whether you invest heavily into that melee healing playstyle or not, which opens up quite a bit of opportunity for them to play into a variety of different builds. Although you could of course buff that damage or healing transfer back up with Jadefire Teachings in order to make it even more effective, kind of very similar to how it used to play. But now there's actually a new talent choice on the same row as that ability with Rushing Wind Kick, which gives your Rising Sun Kick more of a range damage component, where instead of having to use the ability for melee, you could actually use it from a distance, and it can cleave multiple enemies, hitting them at once, and with its damage scaling per target that it hits. It also grants you a new little buff called Refreshing Winds, which actually amps up the healing of Renew and Miss for a few seconds after using this ability, which also can play into Renew and Miss heavy builds, whether in raids or in Mythic Plus situations. Now, going back to Jadefire Teachings, for instance, there's actually quite a new exciting synergy for this one as well. After casting Jadefire Stomp or Thunder Focus Tea, you activate Jadefire Teachings, which enhances Ancient Teachings, but also the act of drinking Thunder Focus Tea enables other talents such as Jade Empowerment, a brand new talent that allows, after casting Thunder Focus Tea, to increase the damage and the effectiveness of your next Crackling Jade Lightning by quite a bit, while causing it to chain to multiple targets. So you can now activate this melee, or rather damage to heal playstyle, just by sipping on a tea, which can empower your next Crackling Jade Lightning to cleave to multiple targets, which actually, as of right now, offers significant advantages when it comes to its overall healing and AoE capabilities. All of these new talents are a fresh breath of air from Mistweaver monks that offer him a little bit of new gameplay, but also opportunity for new synergies, giving Mistweaver monks quite a lot of flexibility when it comes to how they could potentially talent out the rest of the spectry, but also how it may interact with things like Master of Harmony, because it does have this component of Thunder Focus Tea now has an additional charge, which could potentially be utilized going forward. Speaking of breath of fresh air, Protection Paladin is another spec that's also receiving quite a bit of it, and it really needed when it comes to looking at the popularity of all the tanks right now within Season 1. There's a lot of new class and fantasy changes coming out for the class of Paladin in general from the basic class talent tree portion. And there's a lot of flavorful but also useful talents in here, such as Lightbearer, which allows 10% of all healing done to the Paladin to radiate that healing back towards your allies, to kind of make the Paladin almost like a shining beacon as part of your group, whether you're red, holy, or better yet, protection. So thematically, it's like, there's a cool component to it, but mechanically, it almost just like bolsters your healing, just amplifies it, 10% of it is increased, and it just spreads to all allies around you, which is also really, really cool. And there's a lot of other options available in class talent tree, which are covered over the last few weeks over on the channel. For Protection Paladin in particular, we do see some buffs towards their survivability, or rather group survivability if that's how you want to play it, with things such as Imperial Ward, while Lay on Hands becomes a proper defensive cooldown, or a cooldown that can be used on an ally. With Imperial Ward, Lay on Hands now grants their target 30% increased armor for 8 seconds, so it can be utilized in order to grant you momentary protection at a moment's notice. Together with talents such as Tyrion's Devotion, Lay on Hands cooldown is reduced by 1 second per holy power spent, and things like Uther's Counsel. Your Lay on Hands, Divine Shield, Blessing Protection, as well as Blessing Spell Warden all have a 30% reduced cooldown, so you can actually let you use the ability of Lay on Hands pretty regularly. When it comes to basics of gameplay, prop paladins can finally pick up things like Divine Toll, as well as all those augmented talents together with Divine Purpose, which will fuel them full of resources to make sure that the Word of Glory as well as Shield of Righteousness are always available and at the ready at a moment's notice. In the spec talent tree, we even get some new improvements such as Refining Fire, which greatly buffs the damage of Avenger's Shield, which is a nice bit of additional gameplay and additional damage for a single talent point cost. But we also saw a couple of other adjustments in the spec talent tree, such as Gift of the Golden Valkyrie becoming a single talent point cost, but also Uther's Counsel, which basically doubles the value of some of those basic, but also very, very important key talents. But also there's been a bunch of other baseline talents that have been removed from the talent trees and have been basically given back to the paladin directly. Things like Seal of Warder, which is effectively baseline, which is a buff from the buff of Emotes of Light, which further interacts with Eye of Tyr. Talent of Justification has become baseline, which simply increases the effectiveness of your judgment. Strength of Conviction is also baseline, which increases the effectiveness of your heal for Word of Glory, but also the armor and the effectiveness value of your Shield of the Righteous, so you get even better mitigation. When it comes to mobility, Warhorse has become a baseline with the ability of Divine Steed, no longer something you have to talent into, so you basically get even more mobility as a Protection Paladin. Generally, all of these changes are seen as a good improvement for Protection Paladin that gives us an opportunity to shine going forward, as long as all of the PTR bugs are fixed before the live release. The next spec is very, very near and dear to me, and that is the Outlaw Rogue, which is getting a number of changes to make playing the spec as much of a smooth experience as it can be. Rogues in general have seen a number of changes in their class talent tree, like the ability for Subtlety and Assassination to get basically baseline double shadow steps for those specs, while Outlaw loses shadow step but gains double the uses of grappling hook. But together with a fate bound, you can actually use grappling hook multiple times in a row without putting the ability on cooldown, which allows the spec of Outlaw to cover large distances very, very rapidly. All three rogue specs, including Outlaw, also now gain basically passive slice and dice, where you no longer actually need to have slice and dice on your bars whatsoever, because basic abilities like Eviscerates and Venoms and Dispatches will now grant you 3 seconds of slice and dice per cover point spent. So slice and dice becomes a button you no longer have to manage at all going forward, which can create a little bit less bloat when it comes to your button presses. Speaking of reducing bloat, the ability of Echo and Reprimand gone. The most confusing ability that is so hard to explain in a guide is now completely removed out of the game whatsoever, which is such a good change and replaced with Supercharger, a better version of the ability. Roll the Bones basically will buff up your next 2 finishers with supercharged combo points, acting as if they consume 2 additional combo points. For Outlaw, this means you basically are probably going to be using Roll the Bones on cooldown to empower your next 2 finishers, which would mean that the whole minutia of having to manage Roll the Bones buffs and having to decide whether you want to roll or not re-roll, all that goes out of the window because you're rolling just to empower your next few finishers, which may just be more effective overall. Subterfuge is another new interesting talent that actually empowers the benefits of all other stealth-based abilities. So if there's a talent that works based off of stealth, Subterfuge actually extends the duration of those buffs. So if, let's say, you're playing the Ambush build and you're playing around a talent called Taken by Surprise, that talent can actually give you a 10% haste for 26 seconds after breaking stealth. So basically on Outlaw Rogue, that's a pretty long duration, and that could potentially give you almost perma 10% additional haste as a rogue. And even the talent of Crackshot also helps make the playstyle of Outlaw Rogue even easier. A lot of you, if you're playing Outlaw Rogue right now, might have run into situations where between the Eye's ability and having to track it and needing weak auras for this ability, there's just a lot of minutia that not everybody enjoys. But they're changing the way that the whole Crackshot mechanic works a little bit to make it easier to play. Basically, you could think of a Vanish with Crackshot almost like a way to reload your Between the Eyes. When coming out of stealth, an Outlaw Rogue is able to use ability of Between the Eyes without any cooldown, so it basically replaces your main ability of Dispatch as your primary calm point spender. But out of stealth, this ability does go on cooldown, so you could almost think of it running out of bullets. And Vanish in a way reloads the ability, so now it resets its cooldown. So if the ability was previously on cooldown, you can Vanish to almost reload Between the Eyes, so you can go back to firing out your Between the Eyes back to back at the target. This makes the playstyle of Outlaw Rogue so much simpler than before, where like even a brand new player could pick it up easily. It just means you put Between the Eyes on cooldown, you no longer have to play around any special rules regarding the ability, and you can simply just increase the effectiveness of your Between the Eyes and your overall rotation effectiveness, adding some much needed simplicity to a spec that already has a lot of little gears turning constantly for one single player to manage. Another spec that's receiving even more quality of life updates is the Enhancement Shaman, and actually they're receiving a number of quality of life changes that should hopefully make the spec play and feel even better. Enhancement generally is a very popular spec amongst melee, and one that performs really well at some of the higher end content. But there's still a couple of factors that newer players that pick it up Enhancement for the first time do have a little bit of a harder time with, and the spec is becoming a little bit more approachable. One of the things that's pretty common regarding Enhancement Shaman is sometimes there's a bit of randomness, maybe even too much randomness with its gameplay, but also there's quite a bit of a rotational clutter when it comes to playing Enhancement. As for rotational clutter, they actually included a number of talents in the spec tree to try to reduce some of that clutter. Like for example, you can now have an active version of Ice Strike or a more passive version where Ice Strike can then proc off of spending Maelstrom to buff your Frost Shock instead, replacing it while still giving it basically the same type of gameplay. Or if you just want to make one of your major cooldowns like Feral Spirits more passive because it feels like it's basically active all the time, less of an actual cooldown button for you to use during key moments, you actually can with Flowing Spirits, which just kind of naturally summons Feral Spirits over time, which so far numerically has been a decent talent. It is a talent that's seen a few bugs here and there because there's some stuff that's making it do a little too much damage than expected, but in its current state it actually is a decent alternative to give you more passive usage out of those Feral Spirits without really changing up their gameplay too much, but does remove an extra button for you to have to spam and manage when it comes to day-to-day gameplay. They also buffed up Ascendance by quite a bit through a number of ways, especially if you go all the way down to Thorns Invocation, because now Ascendance can become a 2-minute cooldown instead of a weird 3-minute cooldown, which gives Enhanced Shamans a much better cooldown window. But even if you end up playing deeply rooted elements, they actually gave it better proc rates because now it gets procced by spending Maelstrom on lightning bolts and chain lightnings, and even the proc version of this ability can also help remove some of the button bloat because it actually has a longer duration thanks to Thorm's Invocation, therefore becoming a much more consistent button that synergizes with some of the RNG reducing talents as well. Shaman is a class that's filled with RNG, so they added an ability of Storm Blast so you can control that RNG better. It allows Storm Strike to gain additional charge, so if you want to play around an Ascendance type of build, you can now bank up a couple of charges to get some guaranteed Storm Strikes, but also having more Storm Strikes to play around with your rotation, make sure that you never have a gap within your basic day-to-day gameplay. Then there's Doom Winds, which is primarily a single target ability, but they transformed it into like an AoE cleave ability that does great in single target, but can now be used in places like dungeons as well as Mythic Plus situations or in just cleave gameplay, which makes it just overall more universal. New options like Molten Thunder provide the chance for your Sundering to have a chance to be reset, but also reduce the ability cooldown to make it a far more usable ability when it comes to day-to-day gameplay, especially if you end up focusing on a fire-focused build. And then we have unique things like Voltaic Blaze, where Chain Lightning and Lightning Bolt can have a chance to transform your Flame Shock into like an Earth Shock type of ability that cleaves and does a significant bit of damage. I don't know if this is going to be good as an ability, but it seems really cool. And if you make like a Lightning Nature build, now you can use your fire abilities as an earthy nature ability instead, which is very neat. But where we see some of the bigger changes to further help control the frantic rotation of enhancement is with the hero talents. Like Stormbringer can definitely be a little bit too much. It's very electric, but it can really be rapid and surges with damage and energy and kind of takes over your rotation. And they wanted to pull back on that takeover factor while still making sure that the Tempest ability retains its original oomph. Then we have Totemic, which doesn't really get a lot of play whatsoever, so they're trying to make it a real hero talent, mostly by changing the way that it works with its capstone ability. When you do drop the actual totem itself, you gain whirling elements, air, earth, and fire, and those have changed. Fire now allows you to control hot hand procs. Instead of letting it be completely RNG mechanic, you can now guarantee that you'll have a very bursty lava lash window, which is awesome. The air proc allows your lightning bolt and chain lightnings to better interact with the totem, and also can play around with the maelstrom, which is so core to the shaman that it's going to feel better. The earth one is a bit of a weird one. It is probably going to be good and could synergize with things like voltaic blaze that we talked about earlier, but at least it gives you a lot more playability factors to make Totemic a little bit better of a hero spec. With it being a class of shaman, it is prone to a lot of bugs as per usual, but hopefully a lot of those are ironed out before 1105 comes out to live realms, because if they are, then that would put Enhancement Shaman as one of the best melees in the game, potentially capable of doing the most amount of damage of all the other DPS classes, let alone melee classes, and would put Enhancement on a really good trajectory going forward with a bit more build variety. So with everything being said, I do want to thank all of you guys so much for watching this video, and I hope all of you enjoyed. If you did enjoy it or found this update informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very much appreciate it. Join our Discord community and leave me your thoughts in the comments down below of which of these specs are you thinking or even planning on picking back up or potentially leveling once the 20th anniversary update officially goes live. As always, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and I'll see all of you guys in the next one.